What's up, everybody? Chris Pennell here. We're going with my quarterback tier rankings for week 13 of the fantasy football season. If you enjoy, make sure you leave a like down below. Subscribe to the channel if you're brand new. Let's dive right into it. And first off, I should mention that we have some really rough bye weeks this week, especially since we're inching closer towards the fantasy football playoffs. But we're without Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Justin Fields, and Joshua Dobbs, all guys that are very fantasy relevant at the quarterback position, and a couple of superstars mixed in there as well. So if they've been carrying you over to the playoffs this year, you're going to be without them this week, so we have to plan accordingly. Let's start with the S tier, and there's only one guy that's going to make the cut this week, and it's Jalen Hurts of the Philadelphia Eagles. He just has such a high floor compared to everybody else in the league. There's other guys that are obviously tremendous fantasy quarterbacks, but no one has that floor of Jalen Hurts. The rushing touchdown upside is unmatched by anybody else. Whenever they're inside the 2-yard line, we are doing the tush push, and we're getting an auto 6 points from Jalen Hurts. It's just what's going to happen. He's averaging a rushing touchdown per game this year, which is insane from a quarterback. 250 yards through the air, over 1.5 passing touchdowns, 70% completion percentage, 40 yards on the ground per game, and over 7 designed runs. That is not counting scrambles. And while the matchup is not great versus San Francisco, this is a big game. These are two of the best teams in the NFC. 3-point spread in the 49ers' favor, but we're playing at home in Philly here, 46.5 point over-under. No reason not to have Hurts as your QB1 this week, especially with the other guys out, like Josh Allen. And then moving on to our A tier, we have Tua of the Miami Dolphins. They get the dream matchup of the Washington Commanders. We just saw Dak Prescott and the Dallas Cowboys offense have their way versus them on Thanksgiving. 29.5 implied team total here for Miami, which is the highest of the entire week. Also the highest over under the week at 49.5. 9.5 point spread in Miami's favor. He's averaging just under 300 passing yards per game, 2 passing touchdowns, a 70% completion percentage, nearly 9 yards per attempt. And when you have Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, your life gets pretty easy over there as well. And this offense just keeps humming. And while they can struggle versus good teams, they really pick apart those bad teams, which you know Washington is. And on the season, they are currently allowing the most points per game in the quarterback position at 24, 270 passing yards, and over 2 passing touchdowns, nearly at 2.5. So easy spot for Tua in the Miami offense, and he deserves to be in the top 3 this week. And then number 3, we have Dak Prescott of the Dallas Cowboys. And while it was a slower start to the season, they have found their groove, and they have been smashing opposing defenses recently, especially as recent as last Thursday on Thanksgiving. While we were all eating dinner, they were eating up that Washington Commanders defense, just destroyed them. 4 passing touchdowns for Dak and a monster day overall. And while I'm not sure we should expect a similar result, it should be another good week for the Dallas offense. Seattle is currently 18th versus quarterbacks, allowing 18 points per game, 250 passing yards, and 1.3 passing touchdowns. On the season, Dak's at 270 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, with a 70% completion percentage. He's got plenty of weapons. Jake Ferguson, CeeDee Lamb, Michael Gallup, Brandon Cooks, you name it, they can do some damage. Even Tony Pollard out of the backfield. So Dak Prescott, comfortable with him being in my top 5 this week. The next few, they're all interchangeable, but you're all starting them no matter what. And I highly doubt you have more than one of these guys on your team, so I don't really think it's going to make too much of a difference. But we're going with CJ Stroud here at number 4. Great performance versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. They did not get the dub, but he did everything he could. And him and Tank Dell, that combination is just so good. And for years to come, I think we're going to be really excited about that dude. And he also has Nico Collins, Dalton Schultz, Noah Brown, Robert Woods. There is no shortage of weapons in this offense. The defense is bad enough to give up points where they're just going to be back and forth, I think, in most games. And if you're looking at the matchup this week for Stroud, so the Denver Broncos are currently 22nd versus the quarterback position, but let's keep in mind, they were awful in the beginning of the season, but they have definitely sharpened up a bit, and they've been tougher, so I don't want to call this a cakewalk matchup or anything, but he's still averaging just under 300 passing yards per game, over 1.5 passing touchdowns. Also ran the ball in a couple of times last week, and he's at the 0.3 rushing touchdowns per game this year. He's athletic enough, so the dude's legit good. The talent's there, and the situation he's in does make him very fantasy viable every single week. So he's a stud going forward. And then we have Patrick Mahomes here in the A tier, rounding that out for the top 5. And while Patrick Mahomes is still the best quarterback of football, that doesn't always just completely translate to being the best fantasy quarterback. 270 passing yards per game, under 2 passing touchdowns, still throwing the ball a lot, just under 35 times per game, and he can run the ball a little bit, 30 yards per game on the ground. It's just, without Travis Kelce, there is no weapons in that offense, so he just hasn't been as productive fantasy-wise, but the touchdown upside is always going to be there for him, so he still deserves to be in the A tier. But the matchup does end up being a little bit tougher this week versus Green Bay. He's allowing the 10th fewest points per game at the position, and their implied team total isn't that high this week at 24.5 compared to most weeks for them. Moving on to our B tier, a guy that's been trending up in recent weeks. We have Trevor Lawrence of the Jacksonville Jaguars, 6 touchdowns the past 2 weeks, half of those being on the ground, which are obviously even better for fantasy purposes. Now, we can't really project that going forward, but it is nice to see those big games from Trevor Lawrence, is what we kind of drafted him for early on in the season. We just haven't really seen the production, but we've finally gotten it at this point. So we've been riding the Trevor Lawrence train. It's actually starting to pay off a little bit. And this is a plus matchup versus the Bengals. Currently 21st versus quarterbacks, having 270 passing yards per game, really 20 points per game. The position also giving up 28 rushing yards as well. But when you're in the same division as guys like Deshaun Watson, who can run the ball a little bit, and Lamar Jackson, that can be slightly skewed. But either way, Trevor Lawrence here with a 23-point implied team total at home versus the Bengals. I'm fine with it here. He's got great weapons. Evan Ingram, Calvin Ridley, who's actually looked good the previous 2 weeks, and Christian Kirk. Totally fine with that. Brock Purdy of the San Francisco 49ers gets a dream matchup versus the Philadelphia Eagles. I'm not saying it's like their defense is atrocious or anything. They're good versus the run. They have a great front seven, but in the secondary, they really struggle. And we just saw Josh Allen have a monster performance versus them. 25-point implied team total on the road in Philly. 46.5 over-under. 3-point favorites. While he doesn't get a ton of passing volume, only 25 attempts per game, he's very efficient with his work. 9.4 yards per attempt and over a 70% completion percentage. And the Eagles are currently allowing 23.5 points per game in the quarterback position, which is the second most. So while he's not the most talented quarterback, he's in a great system and his weapons are elite. CMC at the backfield, George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, who had a great game versus Seattle, and you have Brandon Ayuk as well. You definitely don't have to be great, just get them the ball and they can do the work for you. And then we have Justin Herbert here of the Los Angeles Chargers, and I think I would have him higher if this wasn't on the road in New England. But only a 22.7 implied team total here for the Los Angeles Chargers. And while Justin Herbert's one of the best quarterbacks in football, like I said with Patrick Mahomes, that's not always going to translate to fantasy success week in, week out. He's still having a good season. 260 yards per game, 1.8 passing touchdowns, not turning the ball over a ton. Throwing the ball 35 times per game with 21 rushing yards as well. But the Patriots, while they're still a bit of a pushover team these days, we know they're not in their glory days anymore. They're only allowing the 8th fewest points per game in the quarterback position at 15.7, 230 passing yards, and just over 1 passing touchdown. So I wouldn't exactly say this is a dream spot, but he's good enough and talented enough and a good enough offense to where he's still going to be a quarterback one this week for me. Then we have Sam Howell cracking the B tier this week, and this is purely from a game script perspective because we know the matchup versus Dallas was awful, but when they're trailing the entire game, they got to throw the football a lot, and I kind of expect the same thing here versus Miami, and at least they're playing at home, but a 49.5 over-under, so points are going to be scored in this game, but they're 9.5-point dogs, 20-point implied team total, and Miami, pretty much middle of the road versus quarterback position, definitely an easier matchup than it was last week versus the Dallas Cowboys, but on the season, Howell, he's been really good for fantasy purposes. I believe he's QB4 on the season, 280 passing yards per game, throwing the ball more than any quarterback in the league, 37 times per game. And he has decent weapons to work with, so he's mainly like a game script kind of guy this weekend, but I think it's good enough to make him in the B tier with the bye weeks that we are working with. Jared Goff is going to lead off the C tier. He's been turning the ball over quite a bit recently. I'm not sure we should keep expecting that going forward. I don't like that he's away from Detroit this week, but at least we're in a dome, so that's going to keep him viable. Bit of a tougher matchup versus New Orleans, allowing the 11th fewest points to get in the position, only 205 passing yards and 16.1 points per game. But it's still healthy enough, 25-point implied team total here. He has Amon-Ra St. Brown to work with, Sam Laporta, Khalif Raymond, Jahmyr Gibbs out of the backfield. You also have Jameson Williams, who tends to not be able to catch the ball a ton, but we know he has got big play upside. So I'm fine with Jared Goff. His numbers on the season are still very respectable. 280 passing yards per game, over 1.5 passing touchdowns. So he's going to still be a fringe QB1 for me this week. Just don't love the matchup on the road. And then we have Kyler Murray of the Arizona Cardinals, and his rushing upside is going to keep him as a low-end QB1 every single week. He has scored 18, 22, and 20 points in his 3 weeks starting this year. Rushing touchdown per game on the season, nearly 30 rushing yards. Not the greatest matchup on the road in Pittsburgh, but again, all I care about is the rushing upside at this point. Moving on to the D tier. C tier was very short-lived, but there's a bit of a drop-off at this point. We're going to use Russell Wilson here of the Denver Broncos. And while he's not having like an amazing season, he also hasn't been bad either. The yardage is not there, only 200 passing yards per game. 1.8 passing touchdowns, not turning the ball over. The problem is there's just no passing volume. Throwing the ball less than 26 times per game on the season, but completing most of his passes at 70%. Getting a little bit of a rushing floor, 24 yards per game. And it's a good matchup versus Houston, who's currently 27th versus the quarterback position. So if you are in a tough spot this week in terms of bye weeks, you lost Josh Allen, you lost Lamar Jackson, or you lost Josh Dobbs like me and fighting for a playoff spot. I stashed Russell Wilson last week, so I didn't have to fight for him on the waiver wire this weekend. And I feel pretty good about it. And we're on the road in Houston, so there's no weather to worry about. So I think Russell Wilson is one of the better streaming options this weekend because he's been very efficient with his touchdowns. It's just the yardage has not been there. Then we have Baker Mayfield of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And while it's never going to be comfortable playing him, he is facing an old team, I guess, versus the Panthers. Not sure he really cares about that. And they're only allowing 4th fewest points per game in the quarterback position. But keep in mind, they're just so bad versus the run. That's obviously where they can't give up points to every single position. So it's going to funnel more towards them giving up more points per game to the run than they are versus quarterbacks this year. But I still think it's a beatable defense. With Baker Mayfield, if he can just gunsling it a little bit, which we know he has no problem doing, just throwing it over to Evans and hoping he comes down with the football. So I don't love the spot, but we do have close to a 23-point implied team total. And you're going to see here after we talk about Baker and really after Russell Wilson, it just all goes downhill very, very quickly. So if we can get that 250 in 2 game from Baker, which we know he has the upside for, That might get you through the week, hopefully. And then we have Derek Carr of the New Orleans Saints, and this is a decent matchup versus Detroit. We just saw Jordan Love put up a big game versus them on Thanksgiving and took their usual Thanksgiving L. And while Derek Carr has not been good for fantasy purposes this year, 230 passing yards per game and less than 1 passing touchdown, he at least has good weapons to work with. And they are 26 versus quarterbacks this year. So again, we are not going to get too picky, but if we can get a quarterback in a good matchup with at least some decent weapons back here, we could just limp crawl to 250 and hopefully 2 touchdowns. Like, that's what we want. We want 250 and 2 out of these streamers. And I think Derek Carr has the upside for it this week. They're 4.5-point dogs. It's a plus matchup, 45.5 over under, which is actually a decent total this weekend. So I think he's all right, at least to crack the D tier. And then we have our F tier, and it's going to get very, very ugly. And we're going to lead off with Gardner Minshew here of the Indianapolis Colts. He can do enough to where he can get you 15 plus points. We saw it last week versus the Tampa Buccaneers, which was a very plus matchup. Didn't hate him as a streaming option if you were in dire need of a quarterback last weekend. And while it's not as good of a matchup as it was last week, they're currently only 14th versus quarterbacks. Tennessee is more of a pass funnel defense, and Jonathan Taylor is looking pretty questionable for this game. I guess he's done with I believe it was a finger or a thumb issue, and I guess he's in serious doubt. So if he happens to miss this game, it could be more of a reliance on the passing attack here with Michael Pittman and Josh Downs. 22.25 implied team total for the Indianapolis Colts. Well, the numbers aren't great for Gardner Minshew this year. 200 passing yards, less than a passing touchdown. He's viable. I think it's a decent enough spot, especially if Jonathan Taylor is out. It could just lead to more passing volume, even though they do have Zach Moss, who could fill in nicely, which we saw earlier in the season. Geno Smith of the Seattle Seahawks, and it's just his 2 weapons, DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, that are going to keep him relevant. Plus, with them being 9-point dogs on the road in Dallas, we're in the dome, so we don't have any weather to worry about. And you also have Kenneth Walker, who's going to be questionable. They throw the ball a ton here, and we can walk into 2 touchdowns. I would be fine with Geno. He's one of those candidates to where if you can get the 250 and 2, you take it and run. Jordan Love of the Green Bay Packers, big game versus the Detroit Lions. He got it done on the ground, got it done through the air. Christian Watson had his first great game of the season. The problem is it's a really tough matchup versus Kansas City. But on the plus side, they're at home, so they're not going to have to be an Arrowhead, which is definitely a plus. Still only an 18-point implied team total here for the Green Bay Packers, 6.5-point dog. So if we can just get a mediocre day, like his averages on the year, 230, 1.7 passing touchdowns. So it's a bit of a coin flip if he's either going to get you 1 or 2 passing touchdowns. Hopefully we can get the 2 here. But he does offer something that none of these other quarterbacks that we've talked about recently have, and that is going to be rushing upside. Over 20 yards per game on the season. Not really getting to the end zone too often, but still decent enough to where we'll take our 2 free points compared to everybody else here. And then I hate having him up here, but Kenny Pickett's actually going to hit the list here. And we saw with No Matt Canada, he actually made a couple of decent throws down the field, which I think is maybe the first time all season. Now, I'm not saying Kenny Pickett is good. I think he's terrible. But this is a good matchup versus Arizona. They're currently 24th versus quarterbacks. Deontay Johnson, George Pickens, and Freiermuth actually had a really big week versus the Bengals, although they have struggled versus tight ends all season long. I am not really vouching for Kenny Pickett, but as you can see, we are just running out of options at this point, but at least it's a good matchup at home. Matthew Stafford, brutal matchup versus the Cleveland Browns. They are playing at home, though, in the Dome, so that's a bit of a plus, 21.5 in point implied team total. But they're allowing the second fewest points per game in the position, 160 passing yards, less than a passing touchdown, and 13.4 points per game. Probably going to rely on Kyren Williams in this one, but at least when you have Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, you at least have some upside, even though Cooper Kupp has done absolutely nothing in over a month now. And then rounding out our top 20, we have Will Levis of the Tennessee Titans. He had that one big week versus Atlanta, but other than that, we haven't really seen anything from him. But this is a pretty good spot versus the Indianapolis Colts, who are currently 20th versus the quarterback position. Him and DeAndre Hopkins, we at least know have some big play upside. Other than that, not really seeing too much, but it was either him or Bryce Young, so I'm going to give the slight nod to Will Levis here. With that being said, that's all I got for today's video, so hope you enjoyed. If you did, make sure you leave a like down below, subscribe to the channel if you're brand new. Wish you all the best of luck this week, and I'll see you all next time.